going to start by introducing the moderator for the second breakout session, who is Katja Brose. She earned her PhD in biochemistry from UCSF and is now editor-in-chief of Neuron and the executive editor of Neuroscience at Cell Press. And she has, at Neuron, undertaken a broad expansion of the scope of the journal, building on its historical strengths in molecular and cellular neuroscience. The journal now covers all areas of neuroscience, ranging from molecular and cellular to the systems and cognitive level, neurological and psychiatric disease, genetics, theoretical neuroscience, and emerging technologies. And with that, I'll turn it over to Katja for the moderation of the panel.
Great. So the charge of the afternoon panel is a bit of a shift from the morning. So in the morning, we heard a lot about the scientific advances that are inspiring so many of us, about the tools and technologies that we're starting to use to crack circuits on our way towards thinking about how we might be able to manipulate these circuits to diagnose, cure, manage disease. And the afternoon session is shifting more towards some practical concerns. So looking at the ecosystem of which we're all a part and looking at the infrastructural issues that we need to be keeping in mind or possibly coming up with solutions for in order to be able to realize the potential that we all see in circuit-breaking science. So we have a great panel today, and I'm going to introduce them sort of alphabetical order over on my left. Phillip Alvelda is program manager of DARPA in the biotechnologies office, where he oversees program development around neural engineering. He was previously with NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab and has founded a number of new infrastructure, telecom, and media companies. And he has a PhD in computer science and electrical engineering from MIT. Jeff Borenstein is the president and CEO of BBRF, the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation, which is the largest private funder of mental health research. And he also has quite a lot of experience in discussing mental health issues and the science around mental health to the general public. He has a medical degree from NYU and a fellow at the New York Academy of Medicine. David Bredt is global head of neuroscience discovery for Johnson & Johnson, where he oversees preclinical biology and chemistry research, as well as programs in clinical and preclinical biomarkers and pharmacogenomics. Prior to J&J, David was at Eli Lilly for 7 years as a VP of integrative biology and VP of neuroscience. He received his MD and PhD from Johns Hopkins and was also a professor at UCSF prior to moving to industry. Kunal, we've met today, so I don't know that I have to say all that much, but he's the founder and CEO of Inscopix, and I think he's going to bring a lot of perspective to the table about being a relatively new startup in this space. And Bill Brody is the Irwin Jacobs Presidential Chair Emeritus at Salk University, where he was president from 2009 to 2015. Prior to that, he was president of Johns Hopkins, and he has both an MD and a PhD in electrical engineering from Stanford, and he brings a lot of expertise and deep knowledge of the medical device industry, as well as his knowledge, obviously, of the academic infrastructure. So with that, I thought we would start by setting the stage. I think most people in the room have heard of or been a part of these discussions about changes in industry's perceptions towards neuroscience and the degree to which industry is still interested in, investing in, sees a future in neuroscience. And some of that, I think, may be hype, some of it may be true. But I think it'd be worth sort of setting the stage on, from each of your vantage points in the ecosystem, where do you see kind of the potential in circuit-based neuroscience? Where do you see your industry's hopes for this field? Where do you see your industry's doubts for this field? And I thought we'd start with David and Bill. So David, talking a bit about the view that traditional pharma and drug development has about this particular field, where you see potential and opportunities, where you see challenges. And then we'll move over to Bill, who can maybe talk a bit about this from the perspective of the devices industry.
All right, well, I'll give you my perspective. There's a few in the audience that were like me, on the kind of on the front lines of trying to convert some of the science you're doing into big medicines, which is what pharma does. And from my perspective, the decline that Katja mentioned is infinitely real. So I started in Lilly 12 years ago. Psychiatry was the biggest therapeutic area there. It was amongst the biggest therapeutic areas at AstraZeneca, at GSK, at Sanofi, and on and on. And currently, and each of those groups had 250 people like me, like many of you basic scientists who are doing experiments to try to create new medicines, mostly in psychiatry. Alzheimer's was just sort of catching on at that time. But now there's probably, I venture to say there's probably no company that has 200 biologists doing neuroscience drug discovery anymore. Most pharmaceutical companies have virtually no one doing that. Many of the companies I just mentioned have virtual neuroscience groups. Now that's very different from Alzheimer's disease, which has increased nowhere to near to where the overall neuroscience investment was in big pharma. And the reasons are ones we've talked about, that is the lack of animal models in psychiatry, the lack of overwhelming genetics. Sure, there's some rare genetic mutations that some people think are associated with some psychiatric diseases. GWAS studies are generally not that overwhelming for most common psychiatric diseases. And that's very different from Alzheimer's, where we have very clear-cut biomarkers. And so the investment in Alzheimer's that was modest in the past, of the acetylcholine hypothesis of Alzheimer's created cholinesterase inhibitors. But now though there haven't been any new drugs in Alzheimer's, there's enormous investment, probably more than any other single disease. And cancer as a whole probably has more investment than Alzheimer's, but maybe no individual cancer. And so I think that's what we need urgently. We're all, Tom Insel and others are kind of numb telling this story about the decline in neuroscience investment, but it is absolutely real. We need new evidence that we're going to be able to come up with medicines in psychiatric illness like we have in Alzheimer's. And since psychiatric illness has even a greater environmental component than the circuit-based technologies that we're discussing here, understanding the causes, or at least the outcomes of having psychiatric illness are ever more important to getting the industry to invest. They're rational people, the bankers in Switzerland, who see that the investments they're making in immunology and oncology are paying off more than in neuroscience, and we need to work together to change that.
Maybe, Bill, if you can comment on medical devices, neurotech.
Sure. First of all, I'm not a neuroscientist, so I'm kind of like a voyeur. Looking at neuroscience again after many years. My claim to fame in neuroscience, I played tennis with Vernon Mountcastle for years, if you know Vernon. And all I can say he's a very tenacious tennis player, as well as the late Vernon Mountcastle, a wonderful researcher. Anyway, I had, along my road through academia, I started 3 companies and ended up leaving Stanford to run one 30-something years ago. And I stayed in touch with the field until the mid-90s, when I became president of Johns Hopkins. And I came back on retirement, and I've been looking up venture capitalists who do medical devices, and they say they're retired. They're not doing medical devices anymore. And I say, well, why is that? Well, the FDA is unpredictable. And if you talk about a device for neuropsychiatric illness, it's really unpredictable. And then reimbursement, you get through the FDA and you have a big problem getting reimbursed, so CMS or Medicare is an unpredictable field to navigate. And it's not that it's the timeline for either of those, but the timeline is unpredictable. And for a startup, the time value of money really hurts you. If you takes an extra year to get through FDA or through CMS, you're dead. And then when the investors, of course, want to look at an exit, and very few medical device companies have been able to go to the public market. It's been biotech. And there's a consolidation of the companies. There used to be a dozen companies to buy small company. Now there are really 3 or 4 big ones. So on the other hand, I'm a contrarian, and that says that this is a great area to be investing in, both neuroscience, because the science is really exciting and there's not a lot of competition out there, and there are not a lot of people trying to do the same thing, but you do have to get it funded. And so being creative is really important. The other thing I'll say, just kind of listening to this, is that there's just too much complexity in your field. I understand why it's complex. But if you're going to make a company out of this, you have to figure out some way that's simple, that you can come up with a product. I know there are, I think, a half a dozen companies doing transmagnetic stimulation. I don't know whether any of them are going anywhere. Adam Gazele of UCSF, neuroscientist, has a video game company that he's trying to take through the FDA. So there are some models out there, but I think thinking of how you can build a business, because we're talking about the commercial side, and as Kunal has done, sort of focusing on the research segment, which is, again, has been largely ignored by the big companies. So I think it's a very exciting time, but you do have to figure out how to get funded.
Kunal, maybe you can speak to small company startup and the approach that you've taken to navigate the ecosystem.
It's certainly challenging, and I'll echo the remarks that David and Bill just made. There is a funding void. I mean, there's no doubt about this, and for a small company to be doing what it's doing now in the research space, which arguably it's even harder to build a business model and to build a business in. The way we tried to navigate this space was really putting the science first. So telling ourselves in the very early days that here was an interesting technology that we saw that there was interest beyond our just family and friends who might be able to make use of this. And it was clear that the entrepreneurial vehicle was the right way to take this technology out of our Stanford lab and into the broader neuroscience community. And the reason I say this is because, of course, the core of our platform is hardware and a fairly sophisticated imaging system, and it's just difficult to develop and manufacture at scale, even on the scale of hundreds of units. We're still not talking about thousands or hundreds of thousands. Still difficult to do that in a university-type setting. You need experienced people doing engineering and operations. So we said, let's at least try this out. Bring this technology out. Don't try to raise too much money. Literally just raise the minimum, and we raised only $1.5 million when we were spinning out of Stanford. Get this out as quickly as possible, and just get a few early adopters and see some science. I mean, let's see if this actually results in new science with respect to what we're talking about here today. And much to our pleasant surprise, and it took a little bit of time, but in about 3 to 4 years, we saw certainly a critical mass of science being enabled. And I think it's in large part testament to not just the technology itself, but the philosophy we had from the get-go, which is even if we were to be a quote-unquote tools company and a neuro tools company, we had to take a more solution-centric approach. And what I mean by that is we had to think about, if the question was a researcher wants to understand the neural circuit basis of hunger or addiction, wants to understand the circuits implicated in some disease, what do they really need? They of course need the fundamental tools, but they probably also need consumables, reagents, to target in a cell type specific manner that circuit. They probably need the infrastructure and the analytics to be able to analyze the data. So certainly that was the philosophy. We're still not there yet as a company being able to provide this end-to-end solution, but our belief was that if we could do this, then the research market, the research community would certainly value this. They would be able to move much faster in the context of being able to do great science and publish. And we felt that that would create a virtuous circle of sorts, that science would move fast. In turn, they would appreciate the value that companies like Inscopix is providing to them. And we would be able to appropriate more value than we would by just selling a tool or components, and then use that, of course, plow that back into development and building out the team. And that's really been the Inscopix story. And I think one remarkable piece of this story, in light of the fact that this is a tough environment to survive in, and we're hearing of the lack of funding across the board, we try to be very capital efficient. So just raised $1.5 million to start with, use the early adopters in many ways to help drive us It was a paying early adopter program. And it really was testament to that model that we were able to survive for about 5 years without raising any additional money in a day and age where it is difficult to raise money, whether you're a researcher or a company. So the broader point I would like to make in some ways to answer your question, Katja, with respect to what we could do as an ecosystem and what industry could do and where the challenges are. I mean, we'll all complain about there not being enough funding in this space, but I think we have to do with the resources we have as a community, and I feel there are certain precedents in genomics especially, where in the mid-90s, late 90s, as genomics research started evolving, certainly there was an ecosystem that was created to provide the core tools and the solutions. And as those companies developed, the field, of course, started advancing pretty significantly, and now we all know where the field has ended up. I see some of the same parallels here. The timelines, the timescales might be longer. As Bill said, it's a much more complex space. But I think there's an opportunity for solution-centric companies, even in this very foundational phase, where we're focused still on research, where we still are trying to assess, as this entire day is about the value of circuits when it comes to drug discovery, therapeutics. But even in this foundational era, I draw hope from what happened in genomics, that there was a period of 5 to 10 years where all the focus was on research, and there was an ecosystem of companies, foundations, philanthropy that was created to really help catalyze the government's efforts and other efforts. And I certainly see the opportunities of something similar happening. The last point is, of course, the role of philanthropy and foundations. And that's a very tangible example of how, even in the midst of funding voids, foundations, philanthropy can help connect companies to researchers, to pharma, to the therapeutics world, and in some ways provide the seed financing or the bridge financing to help a program like DECODE, for example, become a reality if DECODE were to be extended beyond the small group that it is today.
Yeah. That's a perfect transition. You don't even need a moderator. I think Phillip and Jeff, it'd be great to hear from the funder's perspective. I know in the prep calls there were a lot of interesting models that you've pursued at DARPA and at BBRF on thinking about how to bridge both the funding gap and the collaboration gap, I'd say.
Do you want to go first?
Sure. Well, from a DARPA perspective, DARPA has always existed to develop technological surprise and prevent ourselves from being surprised by their technologies as a part of the Defense Department. But I think there was, a very forward-looking moment where we realized that the biological technologies, the ability to engineer things with them, was creating a new discipline which would afford drastic new changes in industry and perhaps some really great, not just tactical or strategic leverage, but economic leverage. And so the model for DARPA, though, is very different than many of the other funding agencies where they have a fixed budget and they tend to give smaller grants over shorter periods and academic freedom, yes, but the amount of risk that you can take on a small research grant is limited. You tend to see more evolutionary rather than revolutionary changes that require more material resources, longer timelines, bigger efforts and teams. And so DARPA has always said, well, aim for the stars, hit the fence post, aim for the fence post, hit the mud. So we're going to be launching a lot of high trajectory projects that are acknowledged to be high risk. And so in that sense, DARPA is kind of an unusual funding agency because they have a much smaller budget than the other agencies, a total of about $3 billion under management, compared to 30 plus billion in some of the other agencies. And so we had to be very, very strategic about how do you invest those things where DARPA has successfully developed technology leverage before over a portfolio of technologies from microelectronics, processors, photonics, stealth, RF, GPS, driverless cars. I mean, it's a long list, but we've very consistently been able to say this is a really important point of potential economic and scientific leverage. Let's invest a very large material amount on really risky but potentially very rewarding goals. And of course, we don't take any equity, so it's great for a startup company or a partner or a university to use that as a foundation, and then begin to build industries. But one of the really important realizations that I think historically DARPA has struggled with is beyond the technology demonstration, what happens once you've achieved that first it's working kind of moment. And here in neuroscience, we had one of those fantastic seminal moments back in 2005, the Revolutionizing Prosthetics Program. Jan Sherman, the quadriplegic woman who was paralyzed from the neck down, used the Utah array, plugged it into the motor cortex, and it was one of those things where the first time this sort of thing had been done to a human, we learned just orders of magnitude more in an incredibly short period of time than anything that had ever been done in a single animal experiment. But there's obviously risk associated with that, and we had to, of course, begin with someone who has a really catastrophic condition from which there's no other recourse at the moment to begin those high-risk experiments. Heroes like Jan and some of the other test subjects, enabled that to happen. But that moment was in 2005. And, they had the 60 Minutes show with, Jan, working the arm and shaking the anchor's hand, and, everyone's tearing up because this is her arm. And yet it's not. It's a robot arm, and that moment of, oh my God, this is finally possible. And that's really been DARPA's modus operandi for a long time. Demonstrate the technology, and then once everyone realizes it, kind of step back and let it happen. Now, when you've got an RF technology and the military is your purchaser, great, that machinery can go to work. But if you're in the biological technologies office, the Army is not standing by to buy it. They don't really know what to do with it yet. We're still in the kind of restorative, therapeutic kind of areas. And yes, we have many service members that could, benefit from prosthetics. But that technology demonstration stalled. And there was this moment where there wasn't a company that stepped forward to carry it, into a more productized version, work on the tough packaging and telemetry challenges so you don't have the transcranial wires coming out. Develop a business model, find a market, figure out how to cost it and produce it, and so on. So that never happened. So 2005 to 2015, nothing really happened. Now, I want to be really clear that plenty of things happened in animal experiments, and plenty of things happened in neuroscience in general. But the pace was limited by the amount of information you can get out of an animal. So when I came to the project, the goal was, could we take, 10, 15 years of technology that had not been applied to neuroscience and get that to get us more to a commercial start. But then that was really hard because a lot of those technologies weren't held in academic labs, they were held in companies. The Qualcomms, the Intels of the world, producing things at the 7 nanometer technology nodes for electronics, the advanced photonics. And so part of our challenge wasn't just to say apply the technology because our typical research community couldn't get to it. So we had to come up with a structure to motivate kind of industrial participants that had not been, up until that point, engaged in neuroscience to somehow join the ecosystem. And the solution we came up with that has so far, knock on anything really, is to find a motivation that is directly related to their business if they can but be strategic and look forward enough. And so here, this is where you've probably seen a slow evolution in the DARPA communications where, sensitive to the societal impact and legal and ethical challenges, we're really beginning to get the whole community to ask questions about not just doing restorative things to people that have a deficit, but what could we imagine to kind of free even healthy minds from the limitations of the natural body. So thinking of enhancement beyond restoration.
But you, Jeff, role of foundations, and maybe where would you like to see either people use foundations more or foundations play a larger role in this ecosystem?
Yeah, I think that given the complexity of the problem and where we are now, and the relative lack of funding, that, again, resources are limited, private philanthropy has an important part of this ecosystem. And I think that the private philanthropy, as well as the broader ecosystem, needs to really take a wide portfolio approach to the types of research, whether it be from the top down or from the bottom up. The approach of brain and behavior has been a collaboration between generous donors, it's all private donors, at all levels, some very wealthy people who are very generous, and people of more moderate means who are also very generous. For the most part, people whose family members have been affected by depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, one of the major illnesses, who want to help find a solution. And I think that bringing all of these different approaches together is what we need. And I just want to add another part of the puzzle. I think that engaging the public is extremely important because we need to educate the public about these issues and about the promise of research, not only to enhance and support government support for research, but also private philanthropic. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us to do that, to be realistic in explaining what the promise is, but also to explain the importance of it. And I'll just say another word. I was a third-year medical student in Bellevue when we saw the first HIV patients. We didn't know why young, healthy men were coming in dying. And it was only because of research, because of funding for research, that we were able to make, obviously nobody wants to become HIV positive, but we were able to make it a chronic condition that people can live with. And I think we need to take that approach also for some of these severe psychiatric illnesses that we can make a big difference for.
Great. I mean, one big shift in the last 5 or so years has obviously been these large brain initiatives. So the U.S. initiative, the initiative in Europe, and the rest of the world. And this has really had a catalyzing effect. I mean, we don't know where it's going to go ultimately, but I think consensus is building that it's a good thing for the field. It's investment, it's inspiration, it's attention to neuroscience. How do you think the brain initiatives writ large, so the global brain efforts, can be harnessed to promote circuit-based neuroscience and its potential in terms of translating to therapies for some of these disorders? I don't know, do you want to start, David?
Yeah, I'll start. Again, historically, scientists, even myself, when I was running a lab at UCSF, would go to pharma and sort of ask for money to validate targets and stuff like that. And that was the model, and big pharmaceutical companies like Johnson & Johnson, like Pfizer, et cetera, would fund institutions and sort of hope that $20 million a year for 5 years would yield them something. That model isn't so popular anymore. We still get lots of requests, but that hasn't panned out so well. What's been much more valuable are initiatives like the Alzheimer's disease neuroimaging initiative, which was a cross-company, philanthropic, NIH-sponsored initiative that focused on the diagnosis and the prognosis and the evolution of in that case, Alzheimer's disease. And that's a model that's been enormously successful. Pharmaceutical companies, at least now, don't want to compete on these what we view as pre-competitive kinds of technologies. The instruments we use to measure the diseases, in general, the biomarkers we use to diagnose and prognosticate about the diseases. But we compete, at least in big pharma, in general on the medicine. So things like the ADNI have been enormously valuable in generating enthusiasm and investment in Alzheimer's, and similar kinds of things for some of the illnesses that you've discussed would also be valuable.
I think, again, we're at a point where we want to have all approaches. So I think it's great, the global approaches are crucial, but I also think coming from the scientists, from the bottom up, is crucial. So it's striking that a couple of people in today's presentation spoke about optogenetics as if it's, like a microscope. We did optogenetics and XYZ. I think we're going to be saying the same thing about Inscopix over the next few years, that just sort of taken as we do this. Well, we don't just do this. This came from ideas from individual scientists who then developed it and brought it forward. And I think that's an important part of the ecosystem as well.
Does anyone else want to comment on top-down versus bottom-up approaches?
Yeah, and DARPA, has a curious mix of both. We at the very highest level, we have offices for biological technology or microsystems technology. But other than that, the individual programs are sourced bottom up, where it's someone who has, some large vision, some experience bringing them about. You find them, bring them in, and then they start to generate ideas and programs, in cooperation with the whole performer community. And it's a very iterative process that is really generative from the bottom. And then there's kind of another curious mix once the programs start, where DARPA, unlike NIH and some of the other traditional funding agencies, is much more device and product and application driven, and has tighter milestones and directives. And some research, at high, greater technology readiness levels, that's very well suited. More of the ideation and the exploratory stuff, it may not be as good a mix. Did that resonate with you over there?
Yeah.
But it's an ongoing balancing act, and I think it's an important issue.
I didn't mean to ding but I'll make a comment. We need both.
Yeah.
Andy Grove, the former CEO of Intel, who had publicly announced he had prostate cancer, I would meet with him occasionally. He was a friend, and he would say, "Bill, if you only ran Johns Hopkins like I ran Intel, you'd have prostate cancers cured in a couple of years." And I said, "Andy, you didn't have to discover the unknown at Intel." And I think if you have a need to make new discoveries, then you need a bottom-up approach with a lot of bright people, some of whom are focused on a specific part of the brain or specific topic, but many of whom may be doing what's called curiosity-driven research, because some of those discoveries come from left field, from somebody who wasn't attempting to discover induced pluripotent stem cells, for example, which came out of left field. And on the other hand, particularly for technology development, where you've got a lot of engineering and physics and math involved, but not major discoveries, and sometimes a focused team top-down approach is much more effective. So I think we need both. I think, and we need some places that are highly multidisciplinary and other places that are highly focused on solving a problem. And the trick, at least in philanthropy, is to get donors to understand that you need both, and it's not just, you can't just make fast cures by pouring a lot of money on it. You need ideas. And pharma will tell you that in order to develop a drug, they want targets from academia, not necessarily academia developing the drugs, right? So, and the great thing about the U.S., as opposed to a lot of other countries, is we have this pluralistic assembly of universities that are very different, and research institutions, and the ability to fund them with different models that create that flexibility.
So one topic that we talked about in our pre-meetings as a challenge in the ecosystem was regulatory, so FDA and also reimbursement, CMS. And we don't have a regulatory person on the panel, but I think for basic researchers, having been one at one point, I think there's maybe a lack of an awareness of both some of the challenges that regulatory and reimbursement and thinking about that pose, and also how one can work through those challenges. So I wonder whether those of you on the panel who've had some experience in that direction could say a few words that would just edify the basic researchers thinking about translation and commercialization.
Is there anyone? I think what I will say is that I think in many ways the relationship between new technology and developers, new treatment researchers, and the FDA has been unnecessarily adversarial historically. And since getting to DARPA in the Biological Technologies Office, my experience was actually very different. And that there was a very cooperative relationship between our offices and the early feasibility studies group there at the FDA, both on the device side and the biologic side. So we learned that for the type of really aggressive programs that we wanted to foster, which, keep in mind, these are ones where there's no clear antecedent technology that's been approved. You're developing completely new things. Optogenetics, gene therapy enabled devices, complex microelectronics integrated with photonics that you want in the brain, chronic implants, not just momentary treatments in the middle of epilepsy localization surgeries. And so the key really was to not just develop the technology and then show up to the regulatory branch and say, what do you think? Is it safe? Can we put it in someone? The key was really to engage much, much earlier in the process, even before we had defined the program for what we were trying to do, to understand what were the issues, what would we have to go through, what sort of support would our contractors and awardees need. And in fact, there were some cases where we would discuss some of the technologies we anticipated, and the answer we would get is, well, we don't even have the expertise or the laboratory equipment to understand how we would even evaluate that sort of thing. And so DARPA actually went through the exercise of actually investing in helping the FDA develop some of those internal capabilities, laboratory approaches, and that relationship has really grown. So even in the program definition stages of most of our new offerings, we have the FDA show up at the meetings that are just where the performers are coming to hear about the program for the first time, and we make very clear, if you expect to be in a human in 4 years in these ultra-aggressive programs, you should be talking to these folks now, developing your protocols, developing your approaches, understanding what their issues are in the design. And that has made all the difference.
Great.
So I will take a contrary approach after 35 years of dealing with the FDA. And I served on the FDA Science Board at one point. It's a very complicated organization. They are a science-based organization, but they don't have enough funding, courtesy of the Congress, to have enough scientific expertise to evaluate new technology. So you have to get the FDA involved early. I agree with that. However, it's like going to the IRS for an opinion. They'll tell you, this is our opinion, but it's not legally binding, and we may, and they may come back and audit you and tell you this is not right. And that's the problem with the FDA, in part because they only get called on the carpet when something goes wrong. They never get praised when something goes right. There are people, there are a set of bureaucrats who are stuck inside who are whistleblowers and who would like nothing more than to bring the FDA down, and they can't be fired because they're whistleblowers protected. So it's a complicated, you have to work with them. And I was with one company, we got FDA approval in 37 days. We were stunned that it worked. And I was another one that took 3 years, and after we went through the long process for MRI, they reclassified it from what's called a pre-market approval to a 510K, which is a 6-month approval cycle. So all our competitors went through very quickly. So it's a challenge, and Medicaid is even worse because Medicaid is, the CMS regulations on billing are 3 times the size of the IRS code. So if you have trouble doing your income tax, try to figure out billing. And Congress basically sets the codes. So Congress ultimately decides, so it's a complicated process.
I'll let Jeff finish, and then we'll go to Q&A from the audience.
Yeah, I just want to add, because I think these are important points. And this is where, again, public education and bringing people in to support citizen groups who care about these types of issues can make a difference. Public pressure on the FDA, public pressure on funding from CMS can make a difference. And I think that, again, this is another reason for us as a field to be reaching out to the public to get their support to help with these issues.
Perfect point. So we will have a few minutes for questions from the audience. Corey.
Which is that during the BRAIN initiative, they sent a representative to the NIH committee, Carlos Pena. He came to all of the meetings. He was especially talking to the people in the devices area, saying, come to us early, start to work with us in advance. This is my card, this is how you contact me. And I think that in the past few years, starting with cancer, but now I think looking at some other areas, they are trying to be more cooperative. Whether that's going to be true for the long run, whether in 5 years they're going to be more obstreperous again, I don't know. But I think that, you know, Carlos would welcome hearing from anyone in this room who's starting to think about what it would take to get to the next stage. So as long as he's on the case, it's worth a try.
Echo that for the neurology products and Billy Dunn. We've had a great relationship with that group as well, and helped foster a relationship with pharma. And with respect to pressure from patient advocacy groups, I'm with the Alzheimer's Association. I am concerned about that. We've seen a recent example where political pressure in Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, with a very, very small trial with some questionable data, the reviewers who were closest to the science at FDA were overruled because of political pressure. And I'm worried about that sort of precedent, and that will mean that some drugs will get approved that ought not to be. So, you know, that's just my view.
Tom?
So on the same topic, you know, I think in thinking about the regulatory space, drugs, devices, and technologies are three very different animals. And so for the FDA, the device division is not only a separate division, it's a different culture. And I think most people in the last 18 months who've dealt with that group are amazed at how aggressive and how supportive they are. I want to go back to something that Bill mentioned, which doesn't usually come up in these kinds of conversations, but it's critically important. And that is, we're often so focused on the FDA, but it's actually CMS that often will determine whether something will scale for the population, whether it gets paid for or not. Now, they will sometimes look to the FDA to decide, but that's not usually definitive. And at the same time that this field is beginning to emerge as, you know, having potential clinical products, it's going to be critical to reach out to people within CMS, and that is non-trivial, not clear even who to reach out to often in that very Byzantine organization. But they are really, in the United States, the essential agency for understanding what's going to be paid for and what isn't in the public sector. And most of what we deal with on CNS disease is paid for through public money, not through personal expenses. So you want to be really thoughtful about how they get engaged at some early point. And we haven't really done that nearly enough.
I think then we'll wrap up. So I want to thank the panel.